Hello. This is a brief talk on the revolutionary calendar adopted during the French Revolution. I want you to think about how controversial a calendar can be. Take a moment. Jot down what the most offensive thing about a calendar might be. Does it miss your birthday? Does it skip your favorite month? Does it have too many Wednesdays? In order to understand something fundamental about the French Revolution and about how the Republic founded in 1792 worked, we have to discuss the revolutionary calendar and attempt to rework every aspect of timekeeping in French society as part of an effort to make a clean break from pre-revolutionary France. When we look at the calendar of 1788 or 1789 in France, it looks much like the calendar we use here today in the United States, or the calendar they used in France. This is deceptive. The French calendar in 1789 had the same basic breakdown of days, weeks, and months as it does now, but it had a fundamental religious dimension that is today missing from it. There were 12 months, each one of which varied from 28 to 31 days. There were 52 weeks, each of which was 7 days long. Each day was broken into 24 hours, each hour into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds. So far, so good. The calendar was also broken up into 4 seasons of 3 months each. However, the calendar was also officially divided in fundamentally religious ways, as each day was associated with a particular saint or an event in church history. There were Catholic feast days each month, on which ordinary work was suspended and on which there were special celebrations. There were liturgical seasons such as Advent, Christmastide, and Carnival. Each city, each village, each college, each university, each guild had a patron saint and celebrated that saint's day with festivals and parades. Major celebrations were held on days like Ascension, Pentecost, and Candlemas, and so on. Ordinary people kept track of time via saints' days and holidays, saying something like, it happened on Candlemas, or it was just before St. Lucy's Day. Weeks were 7 days long, which is biblically ordained. The names of the days and months were similarly arbitrary, arising from history rather than any real plan. French names are like those in English, with months named after Roman gods, Roman emperors, and Roman numerals. Keeping track of time on a calendar like this can be a challenge, and it was a challenge for them. Imagine that you are trying to plan an event for the future. Let's say you want to make sure it's not on a Sunday, you want to avoid the Sabbath, and you don't want it on a Monday, which was quite often a feast day in the Catholic Church. How would you know 2 years out what day of the week, say the 3rd of April, would be? You'd have to have a calendar for that year in hand. You can't just easily figure it out. And besides, what republic, like France in 1792, what republic in its right mind would want to have months named after Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, the 2 men who destroyed the Roman Republic? There had to be a better way of handling and describing time. The National Convention, a body elected in 1792 to write a new constitution after the overthrow of the monarchy that August, took up the matter of calendar reform as part of its mandate to reform the system of weights and measures used by the French. The need to reform weights and measures in France had been recognized before the Revolution. Measurements of distance, volume, and weight were not uniform in France, with noblemen, cities, and provinces all having jurisdiction over measurements in their particular communities. This meant that measurements were different in different areas, which immensely complicated trade, taxation, and, believe it or not, scientific inquiry. If one ordered 3 feet of cloth from a different city, one had to specify the kind of foot involved, and there was no basic small measurement by which to say how big a foot was. This meant traders had to keep all kinds of different measurements systems at hand in order to trade. The French quest for uniform weights and measures had not started with the Revolution. As far back as the end of the 17th century, the French Royal Academy of Sciences and the similar Royal Academy in England had been in correspondence trying to come up with a uniform system of measures so that scientists could better communicate their discoveries. Throughout the 18th century, these endeavors continued, and in June of 1789, the French Academy of Sciences set up a Blue Ribbon Committee to reform weights and measures and impose a uniform national system. Not long after, in August of that year, nobles gave up their right to oversee weights and measures in their own territories. In 1790, the new French government set up negotiations with England and the United States to jointly adopt a uniform system of weights and measures. The French system developed over time into what we know as the metric system, today embraced worldwide with few exceptions. The king, Louis XVI, endorsed the new system in 1791 and requested the necessary funding to roll it out nationwide, which was granted by the Legislative Assembly. Despite the rough turns of 1792 to 1794, with the collapse of the monarchy and the hardships brought about by a terrible war, work on the new system continued, and after 1794, the metric system was finally accepted by the convention. The rollout, however, was slow, with reference measurements, the meter, the liter, and the kilogram, not ready for distribution in France until 1799. In the meantime, the question of how to move the French Republic away from the French government's historic links to the Catholic Church dovetailed with these reforms in measurement to allow for the creation of a new calendar, one meant to be rational like the metric system. It was designed to be easy to use, uniform, predictable, and completely neutral regarding religion. It was designed by a committee in the National Convention dominated by professional mathematicians. The committee was led by Gilbert Rome, a famous mathematician and a radical Jacobin. The calendar was proposed on the 23rd of September, 1793, and when approved, came into use that following October. It was retroactive to the start of the French Republic, day one of year one of the First Republic. The First French Republic was the 22nd of September, 1792, by our Gregorian calendar. That day was 1-1-1 for them. It meant that New Year's Day would always fall on the anniversary of the first day of the French Republic, a bit like making the 4th of July New Year's Day in the United States. The calendar was decimalized, as they put it. There would be 12 months of 30 days each. Each month would contain 3 weeks of 10 days each. This made for 360 days, with 5 days left over as a small festival, national holidays at the end of the year, every year. And there would be leap years. Every 4 years there would be a 6th national holiday brought in, with exceptions to make sure that the calendar didn't get out of sync with the celestial movement of the relationship between the sun, the earth, and the moon. This made for a very abstract mathematical calendar. Days were named 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, up to the weekly day of rest, which was called 10 day. Each week was called 1 week, 2 week, or 3 week, and months were similarly just numbered. It was understood, however, that no one but a mathematician would be able to make sense out of such a calendar, and a poet, a man named Fabre d'Eglantine, was commissioned to come up with new names for the months. He based them off the seasonal weather in Paris, making sure the calendar was rooted in nature, in neutral terms, leaving out religion and even history. Months were called things like Germinal, the month when grain began to grow in the spring, and Thermidor, the month when it was hottest in Paris. Over time, each day was assigned a specific item or virtue or craft so that the calendar could be used as a means to reinforce revolutionary ideas. It's because of this calendar that we discuss phases of the revolution after 1793 by their new names, such as Thermidor of year 3, when Robespierre and his allies were purged from the Committee of Public Safety, or Brumaire of the year 9, which is when Napoleon overthrew the Directory. It can all be very confusing. When it rolled out, there was significant resistance to the new calendar, by the way. Some of the resistance was religious, as there were no more Sundays, and keeping the Sabbath was seen as a private matter, not one that bosses or the government had to respect. Religious holidays of all kinds were removed from the calendar and were meant to be kept privately, which meant that any religious holiday need not be respected by the government or by employers. Those who had rejected the constitutional church were particularly put out by this change, and even constitutional clergy had trouble conforming to the new rules, given that they wanted to do their church services on the seventh day, but they were encouraged not to do so. Workers and peasants had a different concern. Under the old system, a day of rest came every seventh day. With 10-day weeks, the day of rest came once every 10 days. And it doesn't take a brilliant mathematician to notice that this meant 52 days of rest every year had been replaced by 41. That's 36 days, one every week, plus the 5 intercalary days at the end of the year. Also of interest was the creation of a republican clock. In addition to the calendar system, the thought was that the irrational 24-hour clock could be replaced by a clock of 10 hours. You can see these clocks in the museums in France. They're wonderful. They just have a 10-hour face. And once, many years ago, a student, when I was describing this system, raised his hand and asked with some confusion, what did they do with the rest of the hours? He wasn't alone. This question was asked in France as well. Changes to the clock and to the calendar caused great confusion and in the end proved unsustainable. The convention abandoned decimal time in 1795, and Napoleon abandoned the revolutionary calendar in 1806. And I want you to think about that. Why do you think they were abandoned? And why didn't the British, who had taken part in the development of the metric system, why did they never adopt it? And why did no other country willingly adopt the revolutionary calendar? I would suggest that it's because what seem like neutral things, weights, measures, calendars, and time, are actually deeply cultural bound and can become very political when there's an attempt to change them. Britain resisted the metric system simply because it was embraced by the French. No one freely adopted the supposed universal calendar that had the first day of French liberty as New Year's Day. Believe it or not, the United States did eventually adopt the metric system. Here in the United States, we have 2 official systems of measurement, our version of the English system and the metric system. All right, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this talk about the revolutionary calendar.